Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the very first event of our 2020 International Animal Law Speaker Series. This series is co-organized by two ABA groups, the International Animal Law Subcommittee of the TIPS section of the ABA, and I chair that subcommittee, and the International Animal Law Committee of the section of International Law, which is co-chaired by Dana Bray and Joan Schaffner. A special thanks to both of them for helping to coordinate and advertise the series, which is open to the public and which we hope to see grow. I'm going to paste my and Dana and Joan's contact information into the chat if you'd like to know a little bit more about our groups and how you can join or otherwise get involved. If you don't wish to join but would like to be on a contact list to be apprised of events like these, please send me an email to that effect using my email address, which again, I'll be pasting into the chat here in a moment. Just a note now that we'll be taking questions at the end of the talk. If you can mute yourself until then, if you aren't muted already, which was the default, to cut down on background noise, we'd very much appreciate it. With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker, who arguably needs no introduction, so I'll keep this short. Professor David Favre teaches at Michigan State University, where he's taught for over 40 years in areas that include animal law, wildlife law, property law, and international environmental law. In addition to being the author of numerous articles and the International Animal Welfare Treaty that he'll be discussing today, Professor Favre has numerous books to his name, including such titles as Animal Law and Dog Behavior, his casebook, Animal Law, Welfare, Interests and Rights, and International Trade in Endangered Species, among others. Notably, Professor Favre was a founding officer of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, as well as served as vice chair of the Animal Law TIPS Committee for several years. I know I speak for many here, David, when I say that your website, Animal Law Info, has been instrumental in building knowledge around and adding clarity to sort of this nascent field of animal law. I'm not sure how this works in sort of these digital arenas, but please join me in welcoming Professor David Favre.
Thank you. Hi, wave, yes, waves are good. I know a number of you, and I'm glad to see some familiar faces. The rest of you are welcome, and I hope I can get to know you. It's a little cloudy here, but otherwise everybody's safe, and I hope everybody's healthy and safe wherever you are located. This project has a fairly long history. I've been teaching international environmental law for over 20 years here at the university. And at the moment we're teaching, my class is discussing the global warming and the climate change treaty. And if you want a really depressing topic beyond the SARS, that is clearly one, because we are failing in our international relations there. But as to animal issues, I became, as a board member of ALDF, I became the international rep for doing things, and I got the privilege of being an official delegate to the Conference of the Parties of CITES, the Convention for Protection of Endangered Species, and attended about 6 or 7 of those conferences. I'm afraid I've lost track, and associated trips with CITES. So I got to learn how CITES worked in the real world. Those are 2-week meetings that you go to, and you learn a lot about the real world and how treaties work. It just so happens that somebody who's joined us today joined me at the CITES meetings as a representative of Israel. Bill Clark is here with us today, and he and I got to talking about how we sort of thought that maybe CITES could have something to do with promoting animal welfare, but it didn't really seem like it was going to do so. So why don't we draft a treaty that would deal with animal welfare? Rather audacious enterprise, but we did it. We created a treaty. We actually held 2 public meetings, one in Geneva, Switzerland, and the other in London, England, to receive general comments, and went through a number of drafts. And at one point, we started looking for a country to help us. That wasn't my specialty. I don't know anybody in that level of countries. And we had one shot at a country, I think, at some point, but then that sort of fell through. And then it sort of has been sitting on the side. It's always been there, and it's been on the website. And I finally decided I should bring attention to it again by writing a law review article and explain a little bit more about it. And so that article has now been out several years, and I think was distributed with notice of the meeting. So you all have that. And I think I want to discuss a little bit of why we need this. I think to everybody on this call, it's probably pretty self-evident, but let's just run through a couple of the issues. And the first big issue is that there is still no international treaty that directly deals with animal welfare. There is an organization that is attempting to deal with this, an international organization called the OIE, which is located in Paris, but it's not a treaty. It's an international agreement to deal with the issues of animal health. It was created way back in the 1920s to deal with animal health issues, i.e. when are animals healthy enough to move from country to country is one of the issues that they really focused on for many, many years. And the representatives, the people that come to the meetings tend to be the veterinarians, the state level, the national level veterinarians for all the various countries involved. And then about 8 years ago, I guess it's longer than that now, they suddenly woke up and said, well, not just animal health, but animal welfare is a growing issue. And so they've been dipping their toes into animal welfare issues, but if you read the standards, you will not find them particularly helpful. It's really a checklist of things that need to be talked about and decided with no numbers, no suggestions about what those really should be. So I've not been particularly impressed with the standards they've had so far. I do know that several international animal groups have began to focus on the OIE and attend their meetings and trying to push them into a more robust consideration of what they might be able to do for us, because they are really the only group on a global basis that's even close to thinking about animal welfare. I don't know how successful they'll be, but it's there. But it's also not a treaty, so it doesn't have the same lever of international law that we might with a treaty. One of the things that's different than when Bill and I had addressed this back in the 1980s is the degree to which global corporations are taking over commercial animal transactions literally around the world. And that we now have 4 or 5 major corporations, billion-dollar corporations, that are making decisions about how to raise animals and making it on an international scale. When a Chinese company bought Smithfield pork producing here in the United States, I knew the world was changing. So now all of the techniques that Smithfield had were immediately transferred into China, which was not good. And who knows where they are right now. So that's another interesting topic in of itself, and that is the corporate distribution of power in the area of animals and environmental issues. With global corporations, the only way to really respond to them is to have global standards, because otherwise they, of course, will seek out the least regulated state in which to do the worst possible work. And that's going to now be impacting chickens and cows and pigs on a global basis. So we need to be able to match them. And the flip side of that is some people, some entities are trying to do the right things for commercial raising of animals and consider their welfare, but it usually costs a little bit more money. And so they then are at an economic disadvantage to the global corporations who are seeking out least cost alternatives of welfare. So we would like to be able to support those people who are trying to do the good things for the animals. Also, particularly as in the area of wildlife, not too many people actually think about better welfare for wildlife, except people on the screen probably. Therefore, we need to raise the level of discussion on a global basis as well, and just try to seek to involve more people. A number of people are simply not sure what the standards should be. They want better standards, but they're not scientists, they're not experts, and they're not sure what it is. It would be very useful to have an international reference point for thinking about animal welfare standards. It also, one of the lessons we learned in CITES and in negotiating environmental things for wildlife in CITES is that it's very helpful for NGOs in other countries that are not part of the Western group to have this standard out there, because it gives them something that they can talk to their government about and say, oh, aren't we embarrassed that we don't have these standards adopted in our domestic legislation? It gives leverage to NGOs trying to help develop local government or local laws within countries. One issue I want to sort of put on the side from the beginning, and it's something that is a risk that we all understand, and that is the risk of capture by bad actors. Any international organization has the risk of the large corporations, either directly or indirectly, seeking to get control of that organization and therefore direct its policy. I don't think that's happened to any really bad degree within CITES. I think because they are controlled by sovereign states, there's a little bit of a buffer to the corporate world. I'm not sure the OIE is buffered from the corporate world because the state veterinarians tend to have a connection to the commercial world. How to approach? I'm aware now of two different approaches to a treaty. One is representative of the Paris Accord that we now have for climate change, and the other is CITES. The Paris Accord, which I just got through teaching, that refreshed my memory, is basically a process by which they've created a structure for the creation of standards for greenhouse gases. But there is no actual international standard or anything in the treaty that tells each country what it ought to be doing. Instead, it asks of each country to put forward what their goals would be. So each country has total sovereign control over what they perceive as the best goals for greenhouse gases. So that's one approach. I believe that the Swiss NGO Global Animal Law has been developing a treaty that's structured along that line, where people voluntarily step forward with their standards. Now, obviously that would allow for the creation of a fairly robust set of materials that might have all sorts of good and bad standards within them. But I'm not going to pursue that one right now. We're going to talk about the one with CITES. So if you'll hold on a second, I want to post a few slides. Host disabled participant screening sharing. Rashi, can you give me permission to screen share?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me see how this works.
Okay, I think you did it. Thank you. No, huh. It still says disabled, sorry.
1 second, sorry for the technical difficulty. Let me see here. Okay, can you try again?
That's it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Oh, I pulled up the wrong PowerPoint. I don't think it's worth my going back and trying to get you the right one. Sorry about that. The first thing we want to talk about as a context in which to talk about treaty creation is the concept of sovereignty. I suspect a number of you on this call are familiar with this, but I think it's be important to touch back upon it. And the idea of sovereignty is that every nation in the world has absolute control over what they do or don't do at the international level. They may choose to join something and they may not. There is no majority vote available by which a country can be bound to something as a matter of law without it actually agreeing to do so. The UN General Assembly is not a legislative body that creates law binding upon countries. This means that to have a comprehensive international treaty, you have to draft a document that will attract and not scare off a large number of states. Otherwise, it's not effective. And that's tricky. What do you want to put into the treaty that will allow the states to be comfortable enough to step forward and say, yes, we want to join the treaty. We're willing to expend a certain amount of administrative effort and budget materials to address these issues that are going to come forward. We want to be part of the solution for coming up with appropriate standards for animal care. So I think that's one reason why we haven't had any forward progress for a number of years, is that the motivation of the states to engage in this has just simply not existed. And hopefully that will change in the near future. So understand that all these words that we've drafted are simply starter words. There's no sense that what we have presented here is what a final treaty might look like, because once you put out there a potential treaty, it's then taken by the states, and then they start negotiating. And of course, they want their imprimatur on it to show how important and how bright they are upon whatever word you have. So the difficulty is going to be to craft something that is a good start point, and maybe we'll be able to go forward with it with minimal change. Now, there is one treaty that has the word animal cruelty in it, and that is CITES itself, that governs the treatment of animals in international transportation from one state to another state. It must be done in a non-cruel manner. Other than that, you can't find the word cruelty existing anywhere. There's one other treaty, before we get into ours, that you have to mention, and that is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And that's a whole discussion in and of itself, but let me just note one critical component, and that is under the provisions of the WTO, a country, i.e. the US, has the right to control the nature of products that come into the country, let's say eggs. And so therefore they can have health requirements or whatever it is about the nature of what eggs are. But what they can't do is govern how the chickens were kept in the raising or the producing of the eggs. Okay, so you cannot govern the methods of production under the WTO. That's a violation. So that makes the WTO a difficult place to start, but something that would have to be dealt with eventually. All right, now, what is the general structure of our proposed treaty? We call it an umbrella treaty because there's levels involved in it, okay? And there is the basic treaty itself that is the creation document and sets forward the most high-level principles that would be involved and establishes the scope of jurisdiction for the treaty. The idea is that within this treaty is the power to have protocols, which are subsidiary treaties, but they're still treaties, meaning that they still take sovereign agreement before they can come into effect. This was very much like the climate change treaty that was adopted in 1992, and then the Kyoto Protocol was adopted some 10 years later as an implementing part of that general climate change treaty. And this is the same idea here. You have a general overarching, and then the parties themselves decide which subpart they want to take up, in what order they want to take them up, whatever they want to do to move forward with issues. Now, in our draft treaty, we went ahead and drafted 4 different protocols to give people a sense of what is possible. And we had a companion animal protocol, a protocol for the care of exhibited wild animals, another protocol for international transportation of animals, and a protocol for the taking of wild animals. So we tried to cover a number of things just to be a sample. You could have at least a half a dozen more general categories. Now, in the protocols, however, now you want some place where you can add and subtract things without going through this rather cumbersome and time-consuming process of adopting either protocols or to change the treaty itself. Changing a treaty is extremely difficult. Once it's in place, you pretty much are stuck with what's there. There can be minor modifications, but major changes just simply aren't going to happen in the international level. So instead, you have what we call our annexes or appendices. And that's where CITES has the capacity to add or subtract animals to its 2 critical list, endangered and threatened species list. At each conference of the party, by 2/3 vote, they can add in or take out animals. And that doesn't call for a treaty. Now, there is an escape hatch in that a country can decide to not be bound by a listing, but that really isn't too much to be scared about because within CITES, it's really unusual that somebody takes an exception. So they may lose the vote for the listing, but they don't necessarily and often do not take an exception to the listing once it's on the books. So an annex is a way to come in with the actual numbers. In other words, what should be the particular size or how would you keep a lion in captivity? What are you going to prohibit or allow for trapping of animals, et cetera, et cetera. You can come up with the actual standards in the annexes. The basic treaty has 5 basic components to it or subparts within the treaty itself. A general policy statement that begins to sort of set an intellectual context for the treaty. Definitions of terms. Those are often jurisdictional as to definitions of terms. I'll show you one example. Then the actual content of the treaty, some of the substances involved, the directions to the states or what the state is agreeing to do. And then the process involved, the procedure involved for both holding meetings and adopting things and getting to what actually, then the 5th group is how to bring it into a force and effect. What does it, how many signatures, how many ratifications does it take to become an actual treaty? The, The first section of the treaty that we have starts with certain principles, and again, this is all just nice language, and I think it's pretty good, but all of this I would expect to be changed by the parties when they actually start to annotate this stuff. But principles would be like humans and animals coexist within interdependent ecosystems. Humans and animals share an evolutionary heritage. Humans as moral beings have an obligation to act responsibly towards animals. Life has intrinsic value. No animal should be killed unnecessarily or be subjected to cruel acts or unnecessary suffering. One thing to say at this point is that this, in my judgment, cannot be an animal rights treaty. That is not on the table in the future. In fact, I suspect that a lot of people in the United States would be disappointed by some of the language we have here. It's not tough enough. It's not getting down to the nitty-gritty. Well, there's a political decision here again about what is realistic for another 150 countries out there who may not have any animal welfare standards at all. And how do you bring them in? And you got to bring them in fairly jointly. You can't give them the US standards for animal welfare and think everybody's going to jump on board that. That's not going to happen. And the other thing that I think you have to be very delicate about is the realization that human rights are hardly recognized in many, many countries. So to talk about animal rights it's just an insult, really. I mean, most people don't even understand what the term means. About giving individual legal rights to animals would just be an anathema to much of the world and to thinking people in much of the world. They really are still grappling with what human rights might mean. So I don't even want to bring up that phrase in our treaty. You're welcome to try. I just don't think it will work. Then in the definition sections, one of the definitions, again, trying to find some practicality in the world, we defined animal as to mean non-human mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, or fish but then knowing that there's those who want to promote octopi and a few other creatures out there, we say, or any organism which may be included specifically within a particular protocol. So we allow for other than that listing, but that is the line that most legislatures in the United States have been comfortable with, and that is vertebrates. And I think that that's probably a fairly safe place to start within an international treaty. We do define companion animals, animals which humans have possession and control of for the primary use other than economic benefit. Now within the treaty, the top level, we then have a series of articles that set out basically the scope of the jurisdiction of the treaty. Article 6 talks about transportation of animals, and it simply says the contracting party shall take all appropriate steps to prevent cruelty and reduce suffering to a minimum in the transportation of any animal. The article on companion animals, the contracting party shall take all appropriate steps to protect companion animals, to protect animals from cruelty, to assure that humans provide them with reasonable care, and to prevent inappropriate species from being used as companion animals. Again, that's just one sentence creations of what the protocols would then deal with under these articles. One of the things to make sure that this is going to work is you need the parties, the states that come in to join enough of the treaty that it becomes functional. And so we had one section that said no state may become a contracting party to this convention unless it becomes a contracting party to at least one of the protocols at the same time. No state may become a contracting party to a protocol unless it is or becomes a contracting party to a convention. So that would hopefully tie together both the overarching umbrella treaty and the protocols that deal with more particularity. Well, I'm not going to read you the particularities that are defined within the protocols. The whole treaty is available off my animallaw.info website, and it's also the whole treaty is not in my law review article, just portions of it in the law review article. So I guess the ultimate question at the end of all this is it possible that we actually could move forward with creating a treaty here? And the answer is, of course, if we could, right? All it takes is money, time, and political power. So I'm still looking for that country that might be willing to, it is not a small thing for a country to say, I'm going to step forward and take a leadership position on a brand new treaty. That is quite a commitment. And so it's not something that is lightly going to happen, but it's certainly something that a number of countries are capable of doing. Frankly, I would think the US would probably be the last country to do this. They have so many conflicting economic interests that it's hard to think we'd have the political will to do this. But there may be other countries out there and there are a number in Europe, I think, are possible countries as well. So I think that I'd like to leave that as the introduction to the treaty and turn it back to a more full discussion of what we're talking about and what's possible.
Thank you so much.